the season that we're in right now, the holidays, it's something that we all have to deal with in trying to maintain our sense of integrity as it relates to how we keep God's way of life. It impacts us. How can it not? I mean, if you're in an environment where everyone is laughing, it affects you. You feel a sense of festivity about what's happening in that moment. And if you're in an environment where everybody is sad, and again, that affects you. So even though we're in this world, and we're not to be of it, it is hard for the festivities happening around us not to affect us, not necessarily that we're going to join in those festivities with the same mindset that they're using, but it affects you. Me in particular, I think my workload decreases just a little bit in how much I'm putting into it, because it seems like around me people have a mediocrity about them when it comes to this time. They're slowing down a little bit. And you know, maybe not much is going to get done until after New Year's. It's that sense of recognition of your environment. Same way, from God's point of view, we have to recognize what's happening as we see this happening about us. And what's happening about us, in all honesty, is the greatest form of censorship by Satan, and that he is pushing a counterfeit way of living, a counterfeit way of thinking. And the purpose of such a counterfeit is to curtail the relationship that people might have with God, to subvert it, to prevent it, to suppress it. That is the nature of censorship, to keep knowledge from a certain group of people so they don't act on it. This is often seen in the penal system. In the penal system, oftentimes certain books will be banned. And they can get a little carried away and put things up there that you would figure, why is that there? But there's a mentality to that. Books like The Art of War. If somebody, perchance, were to read that book, understand it, and then apply it, then they would have problems suppressing a group of people. There would be uprisings. Were all those things to follow through? And Satan thinks the same way when he looks at the world and he looks at the connection that man ought to have with God. And so throughout the societal cultures of man, this process has been happening, and Satan has been introducing counterfeits. So let's take a look at how counterfeits may have been used in the past, and turn over to Job. Job 38. And I want to set a scene for how I will introduce how we would look at counterfeits. Job 38, starting in verse 1, here we find God having a conversation with Job, where he's sharing certain aspects about things that he had done in the past. And God begins, "Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them." And he begins to pose to Job certain type of questions that undoubtedly Job was unable to really comprehend. "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone, as the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy?" It is that last sentence that I want to draw attention to. God speaks of how he created the world, and he now cites a group of beings that were enthusiastic about what was happening. Now, no doubt amongst those beings would have been Satan, who had not yet changed in his mindset and his attitude. So what we see from here is the angels shouted for joy as the world was created, and it shows that this is a point in time where there was no strife, as we are accustomed to seeing in our own world. If we could turn over to Ezekiel 28, and we find another well-known description of Satan in Ezekiel 28, in verse 14. And here God begins to describe how Satan had originally been created, how he was dressed and suited up, and in the spirit world, apparently he looked very nice. It's also shown that he had a musical skill set. He had some skills musically, and that is addressed. And in verse 14, God begins to speak. I ordained and anointed you as the mighty angelic guardian, or as the anointing cherub. You had access to the holy mountain of God and walked among the stones of fire. So here we see that Satan was appointed position. He was appointed a degree of responsibility and status within the society of these spirit beings that we're looking at. He had responsibilities and things and duties that he had to perform. He had a certain level of security clearance, if you will, in God's government, in this institution, in this type of society. Continuing on, you were blameless in all you did from the day you were created. Now, what does that mean? In other words, Satan, if we were to use how God's way of life is paraphrased into two strong points in Matthew 22, verse 37 to 38. At this point in time, Satan loved the Lord his God with all his heart, with all his soul, if you will, and with all his mind. At the same time, at this point in time, Satan loved his neighbor the way he loved himself. So you were blameless in all you did from the day you were created until the day evil was found in you. So Satan continued with this way of life, this way of thinking, this way of living, with this form of religion, and loving God with all that he had, and loving his neighbor as himself. He continued to live like this until he didn't. Now we would turn over to Ezekiel, Yeah, that's what I want. Ezekiel, we were already in Ezekiel 28. I'll continue in Ezekiel. I'm going to switch translations. I was reading from the New Living Translation. I'm going to move over to the New King James. So still in chapter 28, dropping down to verse 16 and continuing on. Well, not just yet. The end of 15, as I had mentioned, until iniquity was found in you. Once that happened, continuing in 16, God begins to address how his behavior started to change by the abundance of your trading, or rather, in the continuance of his behavior. Violence, you became filled with violence within. So he is strongly departed from the culture that was originally established in this society. And he's taken on a different culture. He's taken on a counterfeit culture within himself towards the way that everyone was to be living. And essentially, he broke all the Ten Commandments and the way that he lived and the way that he carried himself. Now we turn over to Isaiah chapter 14, and we find another familiar description of how Satan was behaving and his background. And here we find in verse 13 how Satan's, his purpose, his mantra had changed from, again, loving God with all his mind, all his soul, and all his heart, and loving his neighbor as himself, to now he's fixated on his promotion. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation. As this continues on, the emphasis is on himself and no one else in society. He wants to now change his position and have a stronger degree of autonomy and what goes on and the control and power that's disseminated in that society that he was working with. Verse 14, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Now, when I was younger, there was a prevalent view of what may have spurned this on. I don't know how often entertained certain assumptions may be carried today, but it was once often shared that perhaps what may have spurred this on, that in the role that Satan was playing in his capacity, that he became privy, possibly he became privy to God's intention of taking physical man and translating these beings into spirit beings that would join the God family and share some of the things that God had access to, by which this perhaps would have initiated the indignancy of Satan, like, really, what, you're gonna do what? And it created a problem. And as this got processed, at some point, and he was like, oh no, we're not doing that. And it created a different direction. It created a different, a counterfeit means of living, of thinking, a counterfeit religion within himself. But it didn't stop there. If we could turn to John 8, verse 44, here Christ further describes Satan. As we cut in, Christ is addressing some of his detractors. You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. Speaking of Satan, and continuing on, he was a murderer from the beginning, and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. Imagine living in a society where there is no such thing as a lie, where no one would ever tell you something that wasn't true. That's an enigma. And here comes someone that creates such a process. What kind of destruction do you think would be caused in that society? And this is what Satan has done. And in essence, he created a counterfeit, again, a counterfeit way of approaching God, a counterfeit way of thinking and processing attitudes towards God. And in so doing, as cited in Revelation 12, this mindset was shared with the other angels, and he corrupted them, and he brought them down with him. No doubt through deceit, through cunning, through lying, perhaps pure rationale. But without a doubt, this corrupt way of thinking, this counterfeit, was now shared beyond himself, further exacerbating damage that is being done in their society with the other angels. And given this picture of disarray, we now fast forward and jump to Genesis. In Genesis 2, we find the story where the earth has become chaotic and disarray, tohu, bohu, all out of sorts. And it's being refurbished, fixed, if you will. And the environment has been corrected, man has been created, and Satan now has the opportunity to approach man and woman with this counterfeit once more. And we see in chapter 2, verse 9, that there were some amenities placed in the garden. And out of the ground, the Lord God made every tree grow that is pleasant to the sight. It looked nice, felt good, and good for food. It tasted good. It was sweet. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and of evil. So they had access, were they to have chosen it, to take advantage of initiating a means where they would have had a deeper understanding of God, were they to have taken from that tree. But there was also some other opposing factors, and that's where we find Satan approaches the woman with his counterfeit. And we drop down to verse 16, where man is given instruction about how to behave. And God shared this with man, and I'm sure that was passed on to Eve. Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. From the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. At that moment in time, that was what they had as truth. And that's the truth that they had to work with. And jumping over to chapter 3 and in verse 2, and now Satan approaches the woman, and he shares with her his counterfeit, and he challenges the truth that she has already been given and the truth that she had come to understand at that point in time. And just a little before verse 2 and verse 1, and he said to the woman, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And as he challenges us, like, really? You're really going to do that? She responds, we may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Again, as far as she was concerned, that was her gospel. That was her truth. That was the word of God. And now Satan introduces counterfeit. Then the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. Counterfeit. And this is what happens with us. This mindset, this attitude that it's all right. You're fine the way you are. It's okay. God will understand. I can skirt the issue here or make some changes here. God's an understanding God. We begin to, and others, begin to place their own sense of rationale, their own perspectives into the viewpoint, into God's instructions, thereby altering the direction you're going in. I can relate to this in the way that I drive. It so happens that I need tires. I need 4 tires and haven't gotten around to it. And so often when I'm driving, my wheel pulls to the right. And if I'm lazy and I'm just casually driving and I have a gangster lean and I'm driving with one arm, I will lose control of the car because the car pulls. And when it rains, it's even worse. So it's one thing to get in your car and question whether you're going to get to your destination. It's another thing where I'm thinking, I'm going to die. I thought I was going to die the other night when it was raining. And it is with this mindset that Satan is introduced that alters your direction much the same way I have with my tires. If I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing, that wheel is going to pull. And when I'm driving, I'm anticipating my wheel to pull because I know the condition that I'm in. And so I drive with 2 hands. And it does pull, but I catch it. I resist it. I endure it. And I can't wait to get to my destination so I can get a break from that kind of circumstance. But this is what was introduced by way of counterfeit. He didn't stop there. He continues on with this counterfeit religion. For God knows that in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. Which is somewhat of a mistruth. Her eyes will be opened. They'll change. The way she sees things, her perspective will change. Opened, as in the sense of enlightened? No. Continuing on. And you will be like God. That's the thing with counterfeits. They copy the authentic to such a degree that there is lie mixed with truth. But even, as I've said before, a little bit of poison mixed with your vitamins will still kill you. And hence, this truth that is accompanying this lie, you will be like God, given the position that he had in God's government, in that society prior, he was full aware of what was going to happen. He knew what was meant to be. So he understood ultimately man was to be like God. But this counterfeit that he enmeshed it in would do what counterfeits do. They censor understanding and knowledge of God, and they suppress further understanding and knowledge of God, which is slowly happening before Eve's face as she speaks with Satan. And he finishes this phrase, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And indeed, she would come to know good and evil, but he left out a very important point that is going to hurt a lot, this understanding. So this counterfeit seems plausible, but as in our religions and customs that surround us, it keeps people from the understanding of God. I was in the city a couple of weeks ago, and it is striking how strong the counterfeit and the mindset of people at large is. And it was the holidays, And everyone seemed to be under the sway of this counterfeit. And it wasn't just, your typical American family with 2.5 kids and they have a white picket fence at home. It was multiracial. There was people there from so many backgrounds in the city that seemed caught up in the festivities. And I was really surprised at how diverse it was. And yet, that is the nature of a counterfeit, and that's what it was meant to do. So, continuing on and moving forward to how this counterfeit presents itself. In chapter 4, we've already passed the point where God had addressed Adam, Eve, and Satan individually. They were judged. Within this period of dissertation, God shares with them a messianic prophecy and the hearing of all of them. And so now we come to chapter 4. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife. They got kicked out of the garden. They continued to live life. They had kids. And she conceived and bore Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Or some renditions might have it in the Hebrew, I've gotten a man from the Lord. Or even still another way of looking at it, I have gotten a man, comma, the Lord, which might insinuate that Eve may have thought that her first child was going to be the messianic fulfillment of perhaps God getting them out of the trouble they've gotten themselves into. There are some that believe she may have had that view, and if she did, of course, that viewpoint would have been shared with Cain. He may have grown up with this perception. Continuing on. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Another nuance to this is that phrase, then she bore again, in the Hebrew some might attest that the way that is written, that they were twins. Nevertheless, continuing on, they had a difference in profession. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, meaning he dealt with livestock and animals, but Cain was a tiller of the ground, and he worked in farming the land. Other people have tried to figure out what kind of shortcomings each of them may have had, and furthermore, some would say that Cain may have done things in a way where he wasn't really following God's way of doing things, in particular some of the agricultural laws that God may have shared with man, and was just like really abusing the land, therefore invoking one of these curses, the land isn't going to grow food for you, because Cain may have been stubborn in how he was doing things. Nevertheless, as we begin to see how they do things, we see two different distinct religions. And in the process of time, again, another nuance, that phrase, in the process of time, some might say could be a reference to the Sabbath, as it would be at the end of days, and how it would be written in other Bibles, another possibility. And if that were the case, then on the Sabbath, they're coming before God as they're practicing their religion and their worship, and you begin to see two different types of religion. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. Those two sentences encompass two different religions. As we read on, God was accepting of one and not the other. There was something about the way these two men were practicing the religion, the way they were engaged in their worship, that was different, and one was approved and the other wasn't. Many have tried to guess what it was specifically that may have made Cain's offering unfavorable and what may have made Abel's more acceptable. And again, some people try to get a sense of what may have happened by how the Hebrew may have been written out, and they claim that the way this is written, Abel also, that also is to say that, one, Cain's offering was seen as a thanks offering, and that when they look at Abel's offering, when they the way it's written, that he also brought an offering, that he too brought a thanks offering. But in addition, he brought a sin offering in dealing with the animals that he brought. And that might have been the distinctive difference that was seen, in that Cain didn't bring a sin offering, if that were the case. He just brought a thanks offering, but not a sin offering. Meaning that mindset, that counterfeit that had been presented to Eve of you're fine the way you are, you don't need to change, may have been part of Cain's way of thinking, part of his religion. Who knows? But nevertheless, whatever happened, Cain's religion, his approach, was not appropriate for approaching God. His was the counterfeit. And Abel's was the one that was more stamped with approval from God. And we can get a sense of that if we turn to Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 in verse 4. Here it has, by faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he being dead still speaks, meaning by that example it still is a reference to how you ought to live, or what is the best way to carry yourself. So Abel's offering and his lifestyle and his religion got endorsed. Cain is also mentioned in Jude. Verse 11, Jude is speaking and he's criticizing the people of his day, and in so doing, he compares them to Cain amongst other individuals. Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, have run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit, and perished in the rebellion of Korah. Now, the company that Cain is in is not cool company. The other two individuals, they have stains on their legacy. Balaam had encouraged the Israelites to live wrong, to sin, to live immoral lives, sexual perversion, and so forth, in hopes of getting God so mad with them, he just cut them off. And Korah was another individual that was really starting to start an uprising in the day of Moses. He was criticizing some of the choices and assignments that were being made there in their day, and accusing Moses of not doing a good job. And in so doing, it started to drift over into a sense of he's criticizing God and being rebellious to God. And he began to get a lot of people behind him, and it created a huge civil discord. So again, whatever Cain may have done, whatever was characterizing his sacrifice, it wasn't good. To be grouped with these individuals, it wasn't good. So the specifics you may not have, but you get a kindergarten level review of his religion. It wasn't good. And lesson to us is not to repeat it. And it's another example of that counterfeit that is presented to us in the past and in our present day lives as we move about. Now, after Cain, we begin to see other forms of counterfeits, and other people rose to prominence, like individuals like Nimrod. He's listed in Genesis 10, I think it is. At any rate, Nimrod had some significance in that the counterfeit that he was presenting was very overpowering of the people, and it was very strong. He really pulled people away from worshiping the true God and following in manners that were not in line with what God would have wanted. Now, I mentioned before, God had given a review to each one of those people that were present in the Garden of Eden. And in so doing, there was a messianic prophecy that God would come and essentially fix things. Satan, too, was also in the audience, and he hears this. And the minute he hears this, immediately, he begins to counter what will happen with counterfeit. Yeah. So many people that are atheists or not very strong proponents of God will say there are examples of things that predate Christianity that are supposedly authentic to Christianity, but there's evidence of some of these themes way before. Themes like the Madonna-child relationship, the Trinity, even though that's disputed, messianic personalities, and even the cross. The cross was widely known in the past and post-flood days as well, in that it represented fertility. So you would have a symbol with a line going through it, and it would represent a man, and you would have another symbol going through it, and that would represent a woman, and that just line would be slanted or straight. I don't recall which one was man, which one was woman. But when you took those two versions and you overlapped them, you had a cross. And so a lot of these things were involved in false worship and in these counterfeit religions. And much of that was substantiated by Nimrod, as he was a very powerful person. The Bible would say he was strong before God, and that phrase means he was strong in place of God. And so these institutions and things that he created, the city that he created, Babel, amongst many others, he was against God and his goals and how people lived. And eventually that city, or what they had made themselves, set themselves up to do in establishing a tower where everyone was going to live in a metropolitan city. One of the problems was God just finished flooding the world. He just wiped everything out. He needed people to populate the world. You're gonna have weeds growing left and right. You needed the world lived in. And Nimrod wasn't trying to do that. And other sources have corroborated Nimrod's existence and his attitude. So his intent was to keep everyone together under a false religion and this counterfeit way of living. And God ceased their plans, confused the language. And when he confused the language, everyone linked up with those that they spoke the same with. And they went their own way, so they dispersed throughout the world. And when they dispersed throughout the world, they took with them the counterfeits that they were familiar with, the false religions and the false symbols that they were familiar with. And now they go throughout the world and they take that with them, and hence, later on, people find this and they're going, well, where's this coming from? It's coming from that. It's coming from Genesis chapter 10. Another example of a counterfeit. A further example of how that counterfeit, once we recognize what it is and how tangible it is and how it's used, we could see that in 1 Kings. In 1 Kings 12, in verse 26. Here we are at a point where the two kingdoms have split. Judah splits from Israel. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. He stays with Judah. And Jeroboam is now the king of the remaining tribes that didn't leave. And he was insecure and felt that if they kept the true days of God, the days that had been appointed by God, that the people would leave. And so he intentionally, knowingly, inputs a false way of living, a false religion, a counterfeit, to keep the people under control. Verse 26, and Jeroboam said in his heart, I am reading, verse 26, continuing on. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David, if these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then the heart of the people will turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah, meaning culturally, they're going to kind of revert back to wanting to be one nation, and he'll lose his hold and his position. Dropping down the verse 28, therefore the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold, sound familiar, and said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. And so another counterfeit has been presented where people are censored from understanding and knowing the true God. And at the same time, the knowledge of God and the further growing to understand God is suppressed. So that's how counterfeits came to be, and we can recognize their existence in the past. That's how they were used and continue to be used today, initiated in the past. Now let's look at how counterfeits would be used today in the present. And we could turn to Luke 10. And in verse 1, here we find Christ is sending out followers of his, 70, to go out to the towns that he planned on visiting before he got there, so that they would prep the towns for his coming, kind of lay an introductory to his arrival and what he would be speaking about. Starting in verse 10, after these things, the Lord appointed 70 others also, and sent them 2 by 2 before his face into every city and place where he himself was about to go. Now, some versions and some schools of the Bible will have 72 as opposed to 70. I am unsure as to why there is that discrepancy. I would be more inclined to think that the correct number is 70, just to stay in line with things with the Old Testament, and that there were 70 elders appointed to help Moses. So more than likely, that number has some significance. It may not have been 72, 70 may be correct. So these men are sent out 2 by 2 to the towns that Christ plans on going to. And they're going to have the same autonomy, the same authority, the same skill set, the same abilities that the disciples had when they were sent out. And we could turn back to chapter 9, where we can see what's described when he sent out the disciples. And just another comment, I'm turning back to see something that actually did happen before the incident that I'm reading. But it's typically in Luke, once you get to about chapter 10 or 11 or so, the accountings are all grouped together of instances and things that happen. They're not necessarily chronological at that point. And you have to match them up with the other books of the Bible to get a sense of when things happen. Luke wrote his book a little differently, really after everything happened. I mean, the other books were written after. This guy wrote his book it was late, almost 80 years after or so. And it was all from eyewitnesses' accounts. You can imagine who's left. Whereas Matthew was actually present. John was present. And Mark, well, his account is based on Peter's recollections. And even still, people debate who wrote these books. But nevertheless, so I'm turning back, and this is chronological, but as you go through Luke and you try to turn back and think it's chronological, it's not set up that way. So in verse 1 of chapter 9, we see how the disciples were sent out. Then he called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. He sent them to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And the same was, I'm turning back to chapter 10 in Luke, the same was done for those 70. And if we drop down to verse 17, we find that those 70 returned. And their expression, they were pretty exuberant. Then the 70 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And Christ actually cautioned them with their response. And he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, meaning I was present, I was there. My account has validity in what I'm saying, and in so doing, what I imparted to you has validity, and it's by that authority that you're able to do things. In a sense, they had a badge, and they tend to everybody, and they saw that people listened. Tend meaning you show your badge, and people respond to whatever you're saying. He continues on, behold, I give you the authority to trample on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing by any means hurts you. Meaning, you can follow through with what I've given you to do. And so he recognizes that. But he now drives home his caution. Nevertheless, in verse 20, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you. He makes a point. Don't focus on that. And he exhorts them that their emphasis should be on the internal change, on using God's Spirit to have a certain mindset. That's what's most important. Not the razzmatazz, not the showmanship of what they saw just occur and happen when they were out and about. But rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven, which is synonymous with that you're using God's Spirit to live a certain way and think a certain way. And that internal change is what's most important, not the outward, look what I can do, which is really cautioning, don't think like that. Yeah. And if we turn over to Matthew 7, we'll see that same thought continued. Matthew 7, verse 21. Christ says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Meaning just because you look like you're a good guy and you smell like you're a good guy, doesn't mean you're a good guy unless internally you're thinking the right way. He continues in verse 22, many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? Which is what the 70 just came back so excited about doing. He continues, Lord, Lord. He says, many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not cast out demons in your name? Again, the same thing that the 70 just came back so excited about. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not done many wonders in your name? That's exactly what the 70 came back saying. And that's exactly what he's cautioning, saying, don't fixate on that. Fixate on the internal part. Because here we find these individuals, however many of them may have been amongst the 70, that found themselves in that same position, that did the same things, but still did not change. Internally, Christ goes, I didn't know you. And in essence, counterfeit. That's what happens, and that's what they would have become. But when we practice that same mentality, as we are in the midst of all these other counterfeits, as we are in the midst of the holiday celebrations and the counterfeits that we recognize, we become a counterfeit if we don't focus on what's most important and process this internally and just focus on the outward church-related, looks like a good guy would do this type thing. Now, whether you have skills where you could cast out demons, that's great, but if you're not internalizing it and doing the things that you need to with God's Spirit by way of studying, by way of prayer, by way of resisting the wrong way of living and thinking, and then repeating that process daily. Study, pray, live right, resist, repeat. Unless you're doing that, then everything else is for naught. Mm-hmm. Whatever it might be. True. No matter how sweet that pound cake tastes. Mm-hmm. If you're not doing what's most important, it doesn't matter. Even if you get here early and set up. Even if you do this and you do that and you drop somebody off and you dealt with the Jackie Robinson Parkway, which is backed up in the belt. But if you're not doing what's important, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's what Christ is really trying to drive home. In the midst of these guys having such degree of power and being overwhelmed by it in a good way. So we looked at how counterfeits formed in the past, how they formed yesterday. Mm-hmm. We looked at how the counterfeits affect us today. Now we'll look at how counterfeits can affect us tomorrow. And if we turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 3, here Paul is telling his audience, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come, referring to more so end time events, will not come unless the falling away comes first. Many would perceive that to be the rebellion by Satan, that falling away, because it would be correlated with the man of sin who would be revealed. This man of sin that is prophesied to come on the scene is someone that will present himself as the head of a counterfeit religion, as God himself. Continuing on, he would be the son of perdition, meaning someone that is destined to fulfill a certain role, a certain negative role at that, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, meaning he sits as God in the way that he carries out his function, as if he were God in his temple, in his throne room, conducting business that would be affiliated with what God would do as he serves his duties. This man will claim to do the same thing, but here on earth. Continuing on, showing himself that he is God. In verse 5, do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? And now you know what is restraining, meaning God is keeping certain things from happening beyond the time that is supposed to happen. Continuing on, that he may be revealed in his own time, meaning this person that is going to be an antichrist. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, or the counterfeits that we have become familiar with is already at work. We've already recognized them. We recognize the part they played yesterday. We see the part they play today. We're now becoming cognizant of how it's going to affect things tomorrow. Continuing on in the middle of verse 7, only he who now restrains, meaning God, will do so until he is taken out of the way, referring to how in delegating authority as God does. I'm good, we're wrapping up. Thank you. In delegating authority as God does, he's having Michael and Gabriel keep these demons and Satan back from doing certain things that they would love to do, to destroy man, to eradicate life.
Yes,
but they're kept from doing that. They're restrained by God and carrying out those duties, the archangels. And then the lawless one, when they're pulled away from doing that, the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming, meaning this man is so powerful and so prevalent that God himself is the one that deals with him. And in Matthew 24, verse 24, it's mentioned that this man's influence is so strong that if it were possible for the elect, for the people that do know God, to be deceived, people like that would be deceived because his skill set is that strong. It's that real. What he's going to present, his counterfeit, is going to be that strong. And that only people that are utilizing God's Spirit in the proper way will be able to not fall under his sway. In John 10, verse 27, Christ says, my sheep hear my voice and I know them, and they will follow me. And then turning over to chapter 8, verse 47, John 8, verse 47, Christ says, he who is of God hears God's words. And he says to his detractors that were in front of him, therefore you do not hear, because you are not of God. So we would look at ourselves and go, if we're doing what we need to do, and we're in tune with God, and we're practicing that lifestyle of loving God with all our hearts and our souls and our minds, and loving our neighbor as ourselves, by way of the process of studying and praying and thinking right and applying the right way of life and resisting the wrong way, and then repeating this process and all the other intricacies involved in it, fasting, so forth, that we do that we will recognize right from wrong. We'll recognize God's way, no matter how hard it is to distinguish for those that don't have that ability that is shared with them by God, having God's Spirit, to be able to do. In Galatians 5, we see how that is to be carried out, and how people that don't have God's Spirit have that shortcoming. Galatians 5, verse 16. I say then, walk in the Spirit, meaning use it in that way. Study, pray, repeat. Study, pray, resist, repeat. Live that lifestyle. Walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. The lust of the flesh being the emotional component of impulse, but not just that, the way we think. The knowledge that comes just from being human is void of the understanding that would come from God and using God's Spirit. But walking in the Spirit, utilizing that, putting this into play, we are then able to do what the body is in the mortal rationale is not able to lend itself to doing. And Paul continues on, for the flesh lusts against the spirit, meaning there's a contrast there, there's a resistance that you feel all the time. It's a matter of which one you choose to give into. The flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. It goes both ways. And these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish, meaning you do what's most inclined to you were you to pursue God's way of life. There's resistance there that you have to overcome. Paul continues, but if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law, meaning you're not under the punishment that would happen for failing to pay the penalty that we're under, but even more so, you're not under the law and that the limitations that law would impose on you and in trying to do things of your own will and your own abilities. So it's important that we use God's Spirit to think in the right way, ever more so when we feel the resistance of being in a society and an environment with the festivities that may have a nostalgia component to it and that seem to be so bright and pretty. We have to understand they're counterfeits. And it's often said flattery is a form of a compliment in the sense that we have the true, authentic way of living. And that's what's being copied. It's being copied because this way is threatening. And this way actually has a greater sense of importance, even though it may look like we're the losing end of the religion popularity scheme. Mm-hmm. We're not. Amen. We're on the right end. Amen. We're on the right way. Mm-hmm. And we have to use God's Spirit to be able to continue to think that when our environment would tell us otherwise, yes, as is embodied by counterfeits, and we resist them.